The study was silent the night Elowyn Caverley's marriage ended. Frost crawled across the tall windows of Blackmere Manor, while wind howled through the northern cliffs beyond the estate walls. Inside the private study, firelight painted long shadows across shelves filled with leather-bound ledgers and unopened correspondence. The scent of cold whiskey and dying embers lingered in the heavy air. Duke Theron Ashworth stood behind his mahogany desk with both hands pressed flat against the surface, his jaw tight, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the frosted glass. He did not turn when the door opened. Elowyn entered quietly, still wearing her evening gown from the dinner she had spent 3 days organizing for his political associates. Pearl earrings rested against her neck, while exhaustion weighed visibly beneath her eyes. She had smiled through 5 hours of conversation that evening, without anyone once asking how she felt. "You wish to speak with me." Her voice remained steady despite the strange tension filling the room. Theron did not move for several seconds. Then he exhaled slowly and spoke without turning around. The physicians confirmed their findings again this morning. Elowyn felt cold air press against her chest before he even finished. "We have discussed this, Theron. Your sister will give me an heir." 5 words. 5 words cracked through the silence of that study like fractures splitting slowly through frozen glass. Elowyn stopped breathing. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her gown while the fire popped softly beside them. For a long moment, she simply stared at the back of her husband's head, waiting for him to correct himself, to say something further, to turn around and tell her he had spoken carelessly. He did none of those things. "Jessamine has already agreed," he continued, his voice flat. "The arrangement will remain private until a child is confirmed." Something enormous collapsed quietly inside Elowyn's chest. Not violently, not loudly, the way a cathedral might crumble from within while its walls still appeared perfectly intact from the outside. She stood motionless for what felt like hours but lasted only seconds. Then, without trembling, without raising her voice, without allowing a single tear to reach her face, Elowyn slowly pulled the sapphire ring from her left hand. The ring Theron had placed there himself 2 years earlier beside the lake at Thornhaven, while the last amber light of September faded across the water, and he spoke words she had never expected to hear again, after everything the world had taken from her. She set it gently on the edge of his desk. The soft click of stone against wood was the only sound between them. Then she turned and walked out of the study without looking back. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and powerful moments of dignity, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these stories for you every single day. Now, let us begin from where it all started. The Caverley family had ruled Thornhaven Estate for 4 generations, and every generation had produced daughters who married well. It was not a tradition the family discussed openly. It was something deeper than tradition. It was the unspoken architecture holding the entire household together, the single measure by which every daughter's worth was calculated before she was old enough to understand the weight being placed on her shoulders. Lord Osric Caverley governed his estate the way a banker governs a vault. Every asset counted. Every alliance weighed. Every daughter evaluated not by what she thought or felt or dreamed, but by whom she could attract, and what that attraction could deliver to the family name. Elowyn was the eldest of 3 sisters, and by every visible measure, she should have been the family's greatest source of pride. She managed household accounts with precision that impressed even the estate solicitors. She remembered the names and children of every tenant farmer across 7 villages. She organized quarterly charity collections for the parish, supervised renovations to the East Wing when the roof timbers began failing, and personally ensured that aging servants received full pensions when Lord Osric would have quietly dismissed them without compensation. The estate functioned as smoothly as it did largely because Elowyn worked behind it constantly. None of that mattered to her family. What mattered was that by 28 years old, Elowyn remained unmarried. Lady Venetia Caverley never said the word disappointment aloud. She did not need to. Disappointment lived in the silence that followed whenever someone mentioned Elowyn's age during social gatherings. It lived in the way her mother adjusted flower arrangements rather than meet her eyes when visitors asked polite questions about future engagements. It lived in the quiet sigh Lady Venetia released each time another invitation arrived, celebrating some younger woman's wedding. Jessamine, the middle sister, had been considered the beauty of the family since childhood. Where Eowyn carried herself with quiet composure, Jessamine moved through rooms like weather changing. Her laughter filled spaces before she entered them. Her copper hair caught candlelight in ways that made older women remember their youth with bitterness. By 23, she had already refused 2 proposals simply because neither suitor possessed enough wealth to satisfy her ambitions. Nobody criticized her for waiting. Beauty purchased patience that plainness never could. Rosalind, the youngest at 19, possessed neither Eowyn's steadiness nor Jessamine's radiance, but she had inherited her father's instinct for calculation. She watched everything carefully, spoke with rehearsed sweetness, and understood before either of her sisters that the family's affection was a currency, distributed according to usefulness. She aligned herself with whichever sister held the most power at any given moment, and currently that meant Jessamine. During weekly dinners at Thornhaven, the seating arrangement told the entire story without a single word being spoken. Lord Osric sat at the head of the table beneath the enormous portrait of his grandfather. Lady Venetia sat opposite him, monitoring conversations with the precision of someone conducting a performance. Jessamine sat to their father's right, the position of favor, while Rosalind sat beside their mother, absorbing every lesson in social maneuvering offered through glances and whispered corrections. Eowyn sat at the far end, closest to the kitchen corridor, a position that conveniently allowed her to coordinate with servants throughout the meal. Nobody had asked her to sit there originally. She had simply drifted toward usefulness over the years, and the family had let the drift continue until it became permanent. Guests visiting Thornhaven occasionally mistook her for the estate's head housekeeper. The first time it happened, Eowyn corrected the error politely. The second time, she simply poured the tea without comment. By the 5th or 6th occasion, she had stopped counting. Sunday mornings were the worst. After church services at the village chapel, families gathered outside beneath the old oak trees, while children chased each other across the graveyard paths. Women clustered in small circles, exchanging news about engagements, pregnancies, and upcoming society events. Eowyn stood among them carrying the same composed smile she had worn since girlhood, answering the same careful questions with the same practiced grace. "And your sisters, Miss Caverly? Any news we should be expecting?" The older women always asked about her sisters first now. The question itself had shifted over the years, sliding away from Eowyn as though her own prospects had quietly expired without formal announcement. "Jessamine is considering several invitations this season," Eowyn replied warmly. The women nodded with bright interest before turning back toward younger conversations. Eowyn adjusted her gloves and walked toward the carriage alone. At home, the reminders continued. Lady Venetia had begun redecorating Eowyn's bedroom with simpler furnishings, quietly redistributing the finer pieces toward Jessamine's chambers. The silk curtains Eowyn had chosen years earlier were replaced with plainer cotton. The writing desk where she managed estate correspondence was moved to a smaller room near the servants' stairs. Each change arrived without explanation, and each explanation, had one been offered, would have carried the same quiet message. "You are becoming less important here." Lord Osric's dismissals were colder but less frequent. He simply stopped including Eowyn in conversations about the family's future. During evening discussions about potential alliances, property dealings, or social strategies, he addressed Jessamine and occasionally Rosalind, while Eowyn sat nearby, close enough to hear everything but never once invited to contribute. Once, during an autumn dinner with visiting investors, Lord Osric introduced his daughters to the table. "My daughter Jessamine, the pride of Thornhaven, and young Rosalind, already showing remarkable poise for her age." He paused long enough for the silence to answer the obvious question. Then he reached for his wine glass and changed the subject. Eowyn continued eating without expression. She had learned years ago that showing pain in this household only created more of it. The afternoons Eowyn spent managing Thornhaven's charitable obligations were the only hours she felt genuinely needed. Every quarter she organized food collections for the poorest families across the estate's tenant villages, personally loading wagons with sacks of grain, preserved meats, woolen blankets, and bundles of firewood cut from the estate's woodland. She kept a small leather notebook listing every family by name, the ages of their children, and any particular needs she had noticed during previous visits. Old Margot Fenwick, a widow living alone in a crumbling stone cottage near the northern boundary, suffered from worsening blindness. Elowyn arranged for a local girl to visit 3 times weekly, paid quietly from her own small allowance, to read letters aloud and help with cooking. When the cottage roof began leaking during autumn storms, Elowyn requested repairs through the estate office. Lord Osric denied the expense as unnecessary. Elowyn paid the carpenter herself and told no one. The Brennick family, tenants farming 40 acres of difficult hillside soil, had nearly lost their youngest son to fever the previous winter. Elowyn had driven through freezing rain to deliver medicine from the village apothecary after the family could not afford the journey themselves. She sat beside the boy's bed for 3 hours, pressing cool cloths against his forehead while his terrified mother wept in the next room. The child survived. His mother still pressed Elowyn's hand silently every Sunday outside the chapel, a gesture that communicated more gratitude than words ever could. None of these things were witnessed by anyone who mattered inside Thornhaven's walls. Jessamine spent her afternoons attending garden parties and portrait sittings. Rosalind practiced piano and studied French with a private tutor. Lady Venetia managed social correspondence. Lord Osric reviewed financial ledgers. The charitable work that sustained the estate's reputation among its tenants, the work that made struggling families speak the Caverley name with genuine warmth rather than resentful obligation, was performed entirely by the daughter the family considered its greatest failure. One rainy October evening, Elowyn returned late from delivering winter supplies to 3 families near the eastern boundary. Her boots were caked with mud, her cloak soaked through, and her fingers ached from gripping wet rains across miles of flooded country roads. She entered the manor through the kitchen corridor to avoid tracking mud across the main hall and found Neve, her lady's maid since childhood, waiting beside the servant's hearth with warm broth and dry stockings. "You will catch your death one of these days," Neve said quietly, while helping Elowyn remove her soaked gloves. Elowyn smiled tiredly. The Brennick children needed blankets before the frost settles. Neve studied her carefully for a moment, the kind of look that carried years of unspoken loyalty behind it. "Your family does not deserve you, Miss Elowyn, and I will keep saying that until someone who matters finally agrees." Elowyn squeezed Neve's hand gently but said nothing. Upstairs, she could hear Jessamine laughing brightly in the drawing room, surrounded by warmth and attention and firelight, while Elowyn stood shivering in the kitchen corridor, invisible to everyone except the people society considered least important. Later that night, while carrying a tray of chamomile tea toward her mother's room as she did every evening, Elowyn paused outside her father's study. The door was slightly open. Lord Osric's voice carried clearly into the corridor. "Jessamine's prospect strengthened considerably this season. If the connections I have been cultivating bear fruit, our position improves beyond anything I had projected." "And Elowyn?" Lady Venetia asked from somewhere inside the room. A pause followed. Elowyn pressed her back against the corridor wall, the tray trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands. "Elowyn is useful here. Let us leave it at that. Useful. Not valued. Not loved. Not worth mentioning beyond her function. Useful, the way a well-maintained piece of furniture is useful. The way a reliable clock is useful. Something you keep because it serves a purpose, not because it matters." Elowyn delivered the tea to her mother's door, knocked once, left the tray on the hallway table, and returned to her own room without speaking to anyone. She sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness for a very long time, listening to rain strike the windows while the house settled into comfortable silence around her. Everyone inside Thornhaven was exactly where they believed they belonged, and so was she. The autumn of 1847 brought the Thornhaven Harvest Celebration, an annual gathering Lord Osric had expanded over the years from a modest estate tradition into one of the most anticipated social events across 3 counties. Invitations were sent to nearly 200 guests, including landed gentry, wealthy industrialists, military officers, 100 guests, and several members of Parliament whose political support Lord Osric had been cultivating carefully for months. The preparations consumed the entire household for weeks. Naturally, every detail fell to Elowyn. She coordinated deliveries of imported wines from a merchant in Bristol, supervised the construction of temporary dining pavilions across the South Lawn, arranged overnight accommodation for 30 visiting families, managed seating placements that required memorizing the political alliances and personal grudges between dozens of guests she had never met, and resolved a near disaster when the florist delivering 200 arrangements of late-blooming dahlias and white chrysanthemums sent half the order to the wrong estate. Elowyn tracked the missing flowers through 3 separate couriers and had them redirected to Thornhaven by sunrise the following morning. During those same weeks, Jessamine attended 2 dress fittings in London and spent an entire afternoon debating whether her gloves should be ivory or champagne. Rosalind practiced a piano recital she planned to perform for guests during the evening program. The morning of the celebration, Elowyn had been awake since before dawn. Dark circles pressed beneath her eyes while her hands carried small cuts from arranging wire-stemmed flowers without gloves. She was adjusting the final table settings inside the main pavilion when Jessamine appeared at the entrance, glowing in pale rose silk with her copper hair pinned beneath a crown of tiny pearls. Jessamine surveyed the decorated space with mild interest, then turned toward Elowyn. The candles on the western tables are uneven. Guests arriving from that direction will notice immediately. Elowyn glanced at the candles. They were perfectly level, but she adjusted them anyway, without responding. By late afternoon, carriages began arriving in steady procession along the gravel drive. Women in embroidered gowns and fur-trimmed cloaks descended from polished coaches, while gentlemen in dark coats and tall hats greeted Lord Osric with firm handshakes and rehearsed compliments. The pavilion smelled of roasted venison, buttered parsnips, baked apples glazed with honey, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, and enormous pots of spiced cider steaming gently beside silver ladles. Musicians played waltzes from a raised platform draped in autumn garlands, while children chased each other between the decorated columns. Elowyn moved through the gathering like a current beneath the surface of calm water. She resolved a seating dispute between 2 feuding families before either party realized they had been separated. She discreetly replaced a cracked serving dish before guests noticed the damage. She calmed a young kitchen boy who had burned himself carrying a pot of hot cider and wrapped his hand carefully while speaking quietly enough to stop his crying before anyone important heard. Nobody thanked her. Nobody noticed. The celebration simply worked, and because it worked, everyone assumed it had organized itself. Midway through the evening, a distinguished older gentleman approached Elowyn while she arranged replacement candles near the western pavilion. "Pardon me, miss. Could you fetch another bottle of the Bordeaux? The table near the fountain appears to have run dry." Elowyn recognized him as Lord Pemberton, a longtime associate of her father who had visited Thornhaven at least a dozen times over the years. He had met her as a child. He had danced with her at a Christmas gathering when she was 20. He did not recognize her now. "Of course, my lord," Elowyn replied, and retrieved the wine without correcting him. Neve witnessed the exchange from across the pavilion. Her jaw tightened visibly, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to say about a wound that reopened so regularly, it no longer fully closed. During dinner, Lord Osric rose to address the gathered guests with a crystal glass raised high. Thornhaven has always represented the finest values of English society: hard work, loyalty, and the enduring strength of family. Tonight I am proud to share that my daughter Jessamine has received a formal courtship proposal from Sir Gideon Hale of Ashbrook Hall. Applause filled the pavilion immediately. Jessamine smiled radiantly beside her mother while Rosalind clapped with calculated enthusiasm. Guests raised glasses toward the family table with warm congratulations. Lord Osric continued proudly. "Sir Gideon represents precisely the kind of alliance that secures a family's legacy for generations." Not once during the speech did he glance toward Elowyn. She sat at the far end of the table, still holding the napkin she had been using to quietly clean a wine stain from the tablecloth before the toast began. A woman seated nearby leaned toward her companion and whispered just loudly enough for Elowyn to hear. "Is that the eldest? The one who never married?" Elowyn kept her eyes on her plate. After dinner, as guests moved toward the dancing pavilion, Jessamine intercepted Elowyn near the corridor between the kitchen tents. "You should change before the dancing begins. That gown is covered in candle wax and you smell like the kitchens." Rosalind appeared beside her with a sympathetic tilt of her head that contained no sympathy whatsoever. "Perhaps you could supervise the servants clearing the dinner tables instead." "You are so much better with them than with guests," Jessamine laughed brightly. "Honestly, sister, If we ever lose our housekeeper, at least we know the position will not remain vacant." Several nearby guests heard the remark and looked away awkwardly. Elowen smoothed the front of her gown and walked toward the kitchen corridor without answering. Inside the dimly lit preparation area behind the pavilions, she found Neve organizing dessert trays beside two exhausted kitchen maids. Neve looked up immediately and read Elowen's expression without needing words. She set down the tray and crossed the space quickly. "What did they say this time?" "Nothing that matters," Elowen replied quietly. But her voice faltered on the last word. Neve placed both hands on Elowen's shoulders firmly. "Everything they say matters, Miss Elowen. That is exactly why they keep saying it." Elowen pressed her lips together tightly and nodded once, then turned back toward the celebration, before the emotion building behind her eyes could reach the surface. Later that evening, long after the final guests had departed and the musicians had packed their instruments into dark carriages, Elowen sat alone inside the cold kitchen, scrubbing wine stains from the linen tablecloths herself because the servants had been dismissed early. Her hands were raw and red beneath the lamplight. The rest of the house slept comfortably above her while she worked in silence. From upstairs, she heard Lord Osric's study door close. Then his voice carried faintly through the floorboards. "Sir Gideon is expected to formalize the engagement before Christmas. If the terms are favorable, Jessamine will secure our strongest alliance in 20 years. "And the eldest?" Lady Venetia's voice replied carefully. A familiar pause followed. "Elowen may remain useful here for now. But once Jessamine is settled, we should consider Aunt Portia's cottage in Wiltshire. Quietly, of course. The questions people ask become more damaging the longer she remains visible." The scrubbing brush stopped moving in Elowen's hand. She stared at the wet linen spread across the table, breathing very slowly, while the house above her discussed her removal as casually as one might discuss relocating an inconvenient piece of furniture to a storage room nobody visits. She did not cry that night. She had stopped allowing herself that relief months ago. Instead, she finished the linens, folded them neatly, placed them in the cupboard, extinguished the lamp, and climbed the stairs to her small room at the far end of the corridor. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence until morning. There had been a time before the silence. Years before Elowen learned to carry pain as quietly as breathing, there had been warmth inside Thornhaven that she still remembered with an ache sharper than anything her family's cruelty could produce. At 21, she had been someone almost entirely different. She laughed openly during dinners, argued enthusiastically about novels with visiting academics, walked through the estate gardens barefoot in the mornings when dew still clung to the grass, and sang softly beside the drawing room windows while autumn rain streaked the glass. Her voice was not remarkable by any trained standard, but it carried a warmth that made servants pause in the corridors to listen. Lord Osric had been less severe then. Lady Venetia still permitted herself occasional tenderness. Jessamine and Rosalind were still young enough that rivalry had not yet hardened into habit. The family was not happy, exactly, but they were functional, and within that fragile functionality, Elowen had found just enough space to believe her life might contain something beyond usefulness. Then Emery Wren arrived at Thornhaven. He came as a guest of Professor Alderton, a botanist Lord Osric had invited to assess whether a portion of the estate's northern woodland could be converted profitably into managed timber. Emery served as the professor's research assistant, a quiet, thoughtful man with dark eyes and ink-stained fingers, who carried notebooks filled with detailed drawings of plant specimens and handwritten observations about soil composition. He was not wealthy. He possessed no title, no estate, no political connections. What he possessed was a gentleness so steady that it changed the temperature of any room he occupied. Their first conversation happened almost accidentally. Elowen had been arranging books in the library when Emery entered looking for a botanical reference. They discussed the book for several minutes before drifting into a conversation about the differences between scientific illustration and artistic expression that lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time Neve appeared to remind Elowen that dinner preparations required her attention, neither of them had noticed the afternoon disappearing. Over the following weeks, the conversations continued. Morning walks through the woodland, where Emery pointed out species of fern and lichen that Elowen had never noticed, despite walking those paths her entire life. Afternoons in the library, where he read aloud from naturalist journals while she sketched flowers she had pressed between the pages of old books. Evenings beside the drawing room fire where they debated quietly about philosophy, about whether beauty existed independently of observation, about whether people could truly change or merely learn to hide themselves more effectively. Emery never complimented Elowyn's appearance the way other men did, carefully and conditionally, as though beauty were a credential being evaluated during an interview. Instead, he told her once, while they sat beneath the oak tree near the lake, that she listened to the world more carefully than anyone he had ever known. "You hear things other people walk past," he said. "That matters more than anything society measures." Elowyn felt something shift inside her chest that afternoon. A door she had not realized was closed, opened slowly, and warmth poured through it. For 3 months, Thornhaven felt different. Neve noticed before anyone else. "You have been smiling before breakfast," the maid observed one morning while fastening Elowyn's dress. "That has not happened in years." Elowyn blushed and changed the subject, but the happiness was impossible to hide. It lived in her posture, in the brightness returning to her voice, in the way she hummed melodies while walking through the corridors. Lord Osric discovered the attachment on a cold November evening. He entered the library without warning and found Elowyn seated beside Emery near the fireplace. Their heads bent close together over a botanical sketch Emery had drawn of a wildflower they had found that morning near the river. Nothing improper had occurred, but the intimacy of the scene, the closeness, the quiet laughter, the obvious affection filling the space between them, told Lord Osric everything he needed to know. The confrontation happened within the hour. "You will end this immediately," Lord Osric commanded inside his study, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Father, he is a good man. He is a research assistant with no income, no family name, and no future worthy of this household. Do you understand what people would say? Do you understand what this would cost your sisters?" Elowyn stood her ground longer than anyone expected. She argued that character mattered more than title. She argued that genuine affection was rarer and more valuable than any strategic alliance. She argued until her voice broke and her father's expression hardened beyond any possibility of compromise. Lady Venetia intervened the following morning with the quieter cruelty that often proved more effective than shouting. "You must think beyond yourself, Elowyn. Jessamine is approaching her debut season. A scandal involving her eldest sister and a man without means would damage the entire family's standing. You would not wish to harm your sister's futures for something so temporary as infatuation." The word temporary struck Elowyn harder than anything her father had said. Reducing what she felt to infatuation dismissed not just Emery but the only version of herself she had ever truly recognized. Emery was asked to leave Thornhaven the following day. Lord Osric arranged it through the professor, framing the departure as a scheduling matter related to research obligations elsewhere. Elowyn was not permitted to see him before he left. She discovered he was gone only when Neve found her searching the library that afternoon and gently told her the truth. "He left a letter," Neve said quietly, pressing a folded paper into Elowyn's hands. The letter was short. Emery's handwriting, usually so precise and steady, trembled across the page. "I did not leave willingly. I will find a position, establish something real, and return for you properly. Wait for me, please." Elowyn kept the letter inside her pillowcase for 4 months, reading it each night before sleeping. She imagined him working somewhere distant, building a life solid enough to withstand her father's objections. She imagined the day his carriage would appear again on the Thornhaven Drive, and the look on Lord Osric's face when Emery presented himself as a man who had earned the right to stand beside her. She imagined these things because they were all she had, and because imagining them was the only thing keeping her from understanding what she already suspected. Then, a second letter arrived. Not from Emery, from Professor Alderton. Emery had contracted typhoid fever while conducting fieldwork in a remote marshland region. He had been ill for several weeks before anyone realized the severity. By the time proper medical attention reached him, it was too late. He died in a small boarding house far from anyone who loved him, with his notebooks stacked neatly beside his bed and a half-finished letter to Elowyn resting on the writing desk. The professor enclosed the unfinished letter with his own. Emery's final words to her stopped mid-sentence. The last line read simply, "When I return to Thornhaven, the first thing I will." The ink trailed off. where his hand had lost the strength to continue. Neve was the one who found Elowin that evening. She was sitting on the floor of her bedroom beside the window, holding both letters in her hands, completely still. Her face was dry. Her breathing was even, but something behind her eyes had closed permanently. She did not cry for 3 days. When she finally did, it happened at night, alone, pressed against her pillow so that no one in the house would hear. She cried until her ribs ached and her throat burned, and exhaustion pulled her into a sleep that felt nothing like rest. When she emerged from her room on the 4th day, she was quieter, slower, more careful with every word and gesture, as though she had realized that the world would take anything she loved openly, and she must therefore love nothing where it could be seen. The young woman who sang beside windows and argued about novels and walked barefoot through morning gardens disappeared so gradually that most people inside Thornhaven never noticed exactly when she left. Neve noticed. Neve always noticed. But even she could not reach the place where Elowin had hidden herself. The season following the harvest celebration brought Sir Gideon Hale to Thornhaven with increasing regularity, and with each visit, the household's excitement grew more insufferable. Gideon was tall, conventionally handsome, and possessed the kind of effortless social confidence that made drawing rooms feel smaller and more important whenever he entered. He spoke about his estate at Ashbrook Hall with casual pride, mentioned his London club memberships frequently, and complimented Jessamine with the practiced ease of a man who understood exactly how flattery operated as currency. Lord Osric treated each visit like a diplomatic summit. The finest wines were uncorked hours before Gideon's carriage appeared on the drive. Fresh flowers filled every room he might enter. Cook prepared elaborate meals featuring dishes Lord Osric had quietly researched as Gideon's favorites. The entire manor performed wealth and refinement with the desperate precision of a theater company staging its most important production. Jessamine played her role flawlessly. She laughed at Gideon's stories with perfectly calibrated delight. Not too loudly, not too softly, always with her chin tilted at an angle that caught candlelight across her cheekbones. She asked questions about his horses, his political opinions, and his family's history with the kind of breathless interest that made men feel simultaneously admired and powerful. Gideon responded to this performance exactly as intended. But Elowin noticed things nobody else seemed willing to see. During a February dinner, she observed Gideon speaking sharply to a young footman who had poured wine slightly too slowly. The words were quiet enough that only those seated nearby could hear, but the contempt in his voice was unmistakable. The footman's hands trembled for the remainder of the evening. On another occasion, while passing the drawing room, Elowin overheard Gideon discussing a tenant dispute with Lord Osric. A farming family on the Ashbrook estate had fallen behind on rent after a poor harvest. Gideon's solution was immediate eviction. "Sentiment toward tenants only encourages dependency," he remarked casually while swirling brandy in his glass. Lord Osric nodded approvingly. Elowin said nothing. Observations from the eldest unmarried daughter carried no weight inside Thornhaven. Jessamine's engagement was formalized in early March during a private dinner attended by both families. The diamond ring Gideon presented was enormous. A cushion-cut stone surrounded by smaller emeralds that Jessamine displayed to every visitor for weeks afterward as though it were a military decoration earned through extraordinary valor. Rosalind, meanwhile, had begun positioning herself with quiet, strategic precision. She attached herself to Lady Venetia's social planning with new enthusiasm, volunteering to manage guest lists and correspondence in ways that placed her name alongside her mother's, in the awareness of every influential family across the county. She had also begun exchanging letters with the younger brother of a viscount, a connection she cultivated with patience that belied her age. Rosalind understood that Jessamine's engagement created opportunity. While attention focused on the middle sister's triumph, the youngest could maneuver unobserved. Yet neither sister's carefully constructed future was as secure as it appeared. Elowin discovered the first crack accidentally. One afternoon, while organizing the household ledgers in her father's study, she found a letter Gideon had written to Lord Osric that had been carelessly left inside a financial folder. The letter discussed Jessamine's dowry in terms so transactional they read more like a livestock purchase agreement than a marriage arrangement. Gideon listed specific financial expectations, property transfer conditions, and a clause requesting that a portion of the Caverly estate's annual income be redirected to support renovations at Ashbrook Hall. The letter mentioned Jessamine's name exactly once. It mentioned money 14 times. Elowyn placed the letter back exactly where she found it and said nothing. She had learned years ago that warnings delivered by the family disappointment were never received as concern. They were received as jealousy. The second crack appeared weeks later. Rosalind's carefully hidden correspondence with the Viscount's brother was discovered not by the family but by a gossiping housemaid who mentioned it casually to Neve. When Neve told Elowyn, the details were troubling. The young man had a reputation among London society for accumulating debts he charmed others into paying. His letters to Rosalind were filled with flattery so excessive it bordered on performance, and he had already begun asking indirect questions about the Caverly family's financial position. Rosalind was being courted for her future inheritance, not for herself. She simply could not see it yet. Elowyn considered warning both sisters privately. She spent an entire evening composing what she might say, how she might present the evidence gently enough to be heard rather than dismissed. Then she remembered every previous attempt she had made to contribute something meaningful inside this household, and the silence that always followed. She put the words away and said nothing. The engagement celebration for Jessamine was scheduled for the first week of April, and the preparations dwarfed everything the harvest celebration had required. Lord Osric, emboldened by the significance of the Hale alliance, insisted the event rival anything London society could produce. 300 guests were invited. A string quartet was brought from Bath. The ballroom was redecorated entirely with imported silk panels, crystal centerpieces, and an enormous ice sculpture commissioned from an artist in Edinburgh. The cost was staggering, but Lord Osric considered it an investment in the family's permanent ascent. Every detail of the preparation, once again, fell to Elowyn, and once again, the woman doing the work was the woman the celebration was designed to make invisible. The name Theron Ashworth carried weight across England, the way an approaching storm carries pressure. People felt it before they saw it. Drawing rooms quieted when his name entered conversations. Politicians adjusted their positions carefully after learning where he stood on any issue. Bankers who managed the accounts of England's wealthiest families spoke about the Ashworth fortune in tones reserved for forces of nature rather than personal wealth. Duke Theron Ashworth of Blackmere-controlled estates spanning 4 counties, including thousands of acres of productive farmland, 2 profitable shipping operations along the northern coast, timber interests that supplied half the shipyards in Liverpool, and a coal mining concern that generated more annual income than most aristocratic families accumulated across entire generations. His influence inside Parliament operated not through the loud maneuvering of ambitious politicians, but through the quiet power of a man whose financial support could build or destroy political careers with a single conversation. At 35 years old, he was considered the most eligible and the most unapproachable man in England. Blackmere Manor itself reflected its owner completely. The enormous estate sat atop dark granite cliffs overlooking the North Sea, its stone walls weathered by salt wind and centuries of coastal storms. Inside, silence dominated the way sound dominates in ordinary homes. Servants moved through vast corridors with deliberate quiet, speaking only when addressed. The great hall contained a dining table long enough to seat 40 guests, but most evenings only one place setting appeared at its far end, illuminated by a single candelabra, while shadows occupied the remaining chairs. Theron ate alone almost every night. He worked alone inside his study until the fire burned low. He walked the cliff-top paths alone during evenings, when the sea crashed violently enough against the rocks below to drown out the silence inside his own thoughts. Invitations accumulated unopened inside a silver tray near his study door. His steward, Bramwell, cleared them weekly without comment. Society had learned years ago that pursuing Duke Ashworth socially produced nothing except polite, impenetrable distance. Then an invitation arrived bearing the Caverly family crest. Lord Osric Caverly was requesting the Duke's attendance at Jessamine Caverly's engagement celebration. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have joined the others in the silver tray. But Lord Osric controlled access to several Northern Railway investors whose cooperation Theron required for an expansion of Blackmere's shipping infrastructure. Refusing entirely risked a business complication Theron preferred to avoid. He set the invitation aside with the expression of a man agreeing to endure unpleasant weather rather than cancel necessary travel. One evening, Bramwell said quietly from the study doorway, "Nothing beyond that." Theron did not respond. He stared at the invitation for several seconds, then returned to his correspondence while rain struck the clifftop windows behind him. What the Caverly family did not know, what almost no one outside Blackmere's walls understood, was that Theron Ashworth's coldness was not temperament, it was scar tissue. 7 years earlier, Theron had married Lady Corinna Ashworth in a ceremony celebrated across 3 counties. Corinna was warm, perceptive, and possessed the rare ability to make Theron feel understood rather than merely respected. Where the world saw the Duke of Blackmere, Corinna saw a man who read poetry beside open windows when he believed no one was watching, and who spoke more honestly to his horses than to most members of Parliament. Their first year together transformed Blackmere entirely. Laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence. Servants relaxed for the first time in memory. The great dining table accommodated guests regularly while Corinna filled the manor with music, conversation, and a warmth that softened every cold stone surface in the estate. When Corinna announced her pregnancy, Theron felt something he had never permitted himself before. Hope that was not attached to strategy or obligation. Hope that existed purely because something good was happening and he believed it would continue. The complications began in the 7th month. Corinna grew weak in ways the physicians could not adequately explain. She spent weeks confined to bed while Theron sat beside her each evening reading aloud from the same novels they had shared during their courtship. She smiled through the discomfort and assured him constantly that everything would resolve itself once the child arrived. The labor began on a February night, during the worst coastal storm Blackmere had experienced in 20 years. Wind tore slates from the manor roof, while waves struck the cliffs hard enough to shake the foundations. Theron waited outside the bedroom for 11 hours. When the physician finally emerged, his expression delivered the news before his words reached it. Corinna and the child were both gone. Theron entered the room and sat beside his wife's still body for the remainder of the night without speaking. Bramwell found him there at dawn, dry-eyed and motionless, holding her hand as though releasing it would make the loss permanent in some way that simply knowing had not. He buried them together in the private chapel overlooking the sea. The headstone bore only their names and dates. No verse, no sentiment. Theron believed grief, carved deeply enough, did not require decoration. In the months that followed, the transformation was total. The warmth Corinna had brought into Blackmere evaporated as though it had never existed. Servants returned to guarded stillness. The dining table accommodated one setting again. Theron buried himself inside work with the single-mindedness of a man using exhaustion as medication. Society interpreted his withdrawal as coldness and responded accordingly. Ambitious mothers continued presenting daughters at every opportunity, convinced that wealth of this magnitude would eventually override personal grief. Young women performed charm and beauty before him with desperate precision, laughing too brightly, complimenting too eagerly, touching his arm with calculated casualness that Theron registered and dismissed with equal speed. He was not interested in beauty performed for his benefit. He had experienced the real thing, and nothing counterfeit survived comparison. His mother, Dowager Duchess Seraphine Ashworth, watched her son's isolation deepen with growing alarm. She visited Blackmere every few months, always arriving with baskets of food she knew he would not eat voluntarily, and conversation she knew he would tolerate only from her. During one visit, she sat across from him in the study while a February storm rattled the windows. "Corinna would not have wanted this for you." Theron continued reviewing shipping documents without looking up. "You do not know what she would have wanted. I know she loved you, and I know she would not have wanted her death to become the last thing you ever felt." The pen in Theron's hand paused against the paper. For several seconds, he remained perfectly still. Then he resumed writing. Seraphine watched him with the patient grief of a mother who understood that her son's walls were built from materials she could not dismantle with words alone. She left Blackmere the following morning, knowing that something beyond conversation would be required to reach him. She simply did not know what. The night of Jessamine Caverly's engagement celebration arrived beneath heavy spring rain that turned the Thornhaven grounds into a shimmering landscape of wet grass and reflected lantern light. Carriages lined the drive for nearly a quarter mile, while servants hurried beneath umbrellas guiding guests toward the entrance. Inside, the ballroom blazed with hundreds of candles reflected across crystal and polished silver. The scent of roasted lamb, honeyed carrots, fresh bread, sugared pastries, and warm spiced wine saturated the air, while the string quartet from Bath played elegant waltzes beneath garlands of white roses and trailing ivy. Jessamine occupied the center of every room she entered. Her engagement gown, pale champagne silk with delicate gold embroidery across the bodice, caught candlelight with every movement. Sir Gideon stood beside her, looking satisfied in the specific way of a man who believed he had negotiated a favorable transaction. Lord Osric circulated among guests with an energy Eowyn had not seen from her father in years, introducing Gideon to every influential person in attendance, as though presenting a trophy recently acquired at considerable expense. Eowyn stood near the musicians, adjusting a table arrangement that had shifted during the earlier rush of arrivals. She wore a dark gray gown she had owned for 3 years, the only formal dress remaining in her wardrobe after Lady Venetia's quiet redistribution of finer clothing toward Jessamine's chambers. Her hair was pinned simply. She wore no jewelry. Then the ballroom doors opened, and everything changed. Duke Theron Ashworth entered Thornhaven the way silence enters a room after a window breaks. Every conversation within 20 feet of the entrance faltered. Women straightened instinctively. Men adjusted their posture. Even the musicians hesitated briefly before continuing. He wore black from collar to boot, unadorned except for a single silver watch chain visible against his dark waistcoat. His expression carried nothing. Not warmth, not hostility, not interest. He surveyed the room the way a man surveys whether he intends to endure rather than enjoy. Lord Osric hurried forward immediately, his face flushed with excitement he could barely contain. Jessamine's eyes widened with recognition. Lady Venetia pressed her hand against her chest. Even Rosalind, usually composed beyond her years, stared openly. The wealthiest duke in England was standing inside their ballroom. Within minutes, the social architecture of the entire evening rearranged itself around Theron's presence. Women positioned themselves along his probable path through the room. Mothers whispered urgent instructions to daughters. Jessamine adjusted her posture and smiled with renewed intensity, clearly calculating whether the Duke's attendance represented an opportunity even larger than Sir Gideon. Theron greeted Lord Osric with brief courtesy, answered several guests' questions with polite economy, and declined 2 invitations to dance within his first 10 minutes inside the ballroom. He accepted a glass of wine he did not intend to drink and positioned himself near the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens, observing the celebration with detached patience. Then something happened near the dining tables. Sir Gideon had been speaking loudly to a group of gentlemen about a recent horse auction when a serving girl, no older than 15, accidentally brushed his elbow while reaching to refill a water pitcher. A small amount of water splashed across the cuff of his jacket. Gideon turned sharply. His voice dropped low but carried clearly to anyone standing nearby. "Watch yourself, girl, or I will have you removed from this household before the evening ends." The girl froze, her face draining of color. The water pitcher trembled dangerously in her hands. Several guests nearby looked away uncomfortably while Gideon adjusted his cuff with visible irritation. Before the girl could stammer an apology, Eowyn appeared beside her. She placed one steady hand against the girl's arm and spoke quietly enough that only those immediately nearby could hear. "You are fine. Take the pitcher to the kitchen. I will bring fresh water myself." The girl nodded gratefully and retreated quickly. Eowyn picked up a clean cloth from the serving station and turned toward Gideon with composed politeness. "I apologize for the disruption, Sir Gideon. May I offer a fresh napkin for your cuff?" Her tone carried no fear, no subservience, and no confrontation. It carried something rarer. Complete self-possession in a moment where most people would have either cowered or bristled. Gideon waved her away dismissively. Eowyn returned to the serving area without changing her expression. Across the ballroom, Theron had watched the entire scene without moving. His wineglass remained untouched in his hand. Something shifted behind his eyes, barely perceptible, like the first crack appearing in ice that has been frozen for years. For the next hour, he found himself watching Eowyn, not with the evaluating gaze he directed at business associates or the guarded distance he maintained toward women who pursued him. He watched her with something closer to recognition. He noticed her refilling glasses that servants had missed, He noticed her quietly redirecting a confused elderly guest toward the correct corridor. He noticed her calming a flustered musician whose sheet music had scattered across the damp floor, kneeling to help gather the pages without hesitation, while guests in silk gowns stepped carefully around them both. He noticed the way every servant she interacted with relaxed visibly, as though her presence alone communicated safety. Most importantly, he noticed that not a single member of her own family acknowledged her existence the entire evening. Jessamine laughed brilliantly at the center of every conversation, while her eldest sister worked invisibly around the edges. Lord Osric presented his younger daughters to every guest of importance while Elowyn stood unintroduced beside the serving tables. The contrast was so stark, so habitual, that it clearly represented years of practiced exclusion rather than a single evening's oversight. During a pause in the music, Theron set down his untouched wine and crossed the ballroom. The movement was unhurried but deliberate, and because every person in the room had been tracking his position all evening, the trajectory of his walk drew immediate attention. He passed Jessamine without glancing at her. He passed Lady Venetia without acknowledgement. He walked directly toward the woman, standing alone near the serving tables wearing a 3-year-old gray gown and no jewelry. Miss Caverly. Elowyn looked up, clearly uncertain whether he was addressing her or someone nearby. She glanced briefly over her shoulder before realizing there was no one else. I understand you manage the charitable collections for this estate. The question was so unexpected that Elowyn blinked before answering. I do, Your Grace. Though it is not something most guests notice or inquire about. I notice what people do when they believe no one important is watching. The sentence landed between them with weight neither of them had anticipated. Elowyn held his gaze for several seconds without looking away, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that the surrounding ballroom could not access or understand. It was not romance. It was not attraction in the way society measured such things. It was the quiet shock of encountering a familiar language in a foreign country. Tell me about the families you visit, Theron said. It was not a request made from politeness. It was not the kind of question designed to fill silence before moving to a more interesting conversation partner. He was asking because he wanted to know. Elowyn recognized the difference immediately because so few people in her life had ever demonstrated it. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes. She described the Brennick family and the boy who nearly died. She described old Margot Fenwick and the leaking roof Lord Osric refused to repair. She described walking country roads in freezing rain to deliver medicine and blankets to families who had no other source of help. She spoke without self-pity and without seeking admiration. She spoke the way someone describes work they consider simply necessary. Theron listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You are nothing like anyone else in this room, he said finally. Across the ballroom, Jessamine's smile had disappeared entirely. Lord Osric stared openly with an expression caught between confusion and desperate recalculation. Lady Venetia gripped the edge of her chair until her knuckles whitened. The Duke of Blackmere was speaking to the wrong daughter, and he showed no intention of stopping. The weeks following Jessamine's engagement celebration produced a sequence of events that nobody inside Thornhaven could have predicted, and nobody outside it could stop discussing. Duke Theron Ashworth requested permission to call upon the Caverly household. Lord Osric granted it immediately, assuming the Duke's interest centered on either business matters or, more hopefully, Jessamine. The first visit disabused him of both assumptions within 15 minutes. Theron arrived, greeted Lord Osric with brief courtesy, declined tea with Lady Venetia, and asked whether Miss Elowyn Caverly might be available for a walk through the estate grounds. The silence that followed lasted long enough to hear the clock ticking in the entrance hall. The walks became weekly, then twice weekly. Theron and Elowyn covered miles of Thornhaven's countryside paths discussing subjects that would have bewildered anyone expecting aristocratic courtship rituals. They discussed estate management philosophy. They debated whether charitable obligation was genuine compassion or merely guilt dressed in better clothing. They argued about whether solitude was a choice or a defense, and neither conceded the point. They spoke about loss carefully, circling around the subject the way travelers approach a landscape they recognize but are not yet ready to enter fully. Neither pressed the other for details before they were offered. What struck Theron most deeply was that Elowyn never once mentioned his title, his wealth, or his influence. She spoke to him the way she spoke to tenant farmers and kitchen staff, with the same directness and the same absence of performance. After years surrounded by people who calibrated every word according to what they wanted from him, her indifference to his status felt disorienting and then necessary. What struck Elowen, though she would not have admitted it, was that Theron listened to her. Not politely, not strategically. He listened the way Emery once had, with attention that made her feel visible rather than evaluated. It unsettled her because she had long ago decided that particular feeling was something she would never experience again. The courtship produced exactly the reactions one might expect inside Thornhaven. Lord Osric, after recovering from his initial confusion, reversed years of dismissal so rapidly that the hypocrisy was almost physically visible. Suddenly, Elowen was invited to sit beside him at dinner. Suddenly, her opinions on household matters were solicited with exaggerated interest. Suddenly, Lady Venetia produced new gowns, commissioned a portrait sitting, and began introducing her eldest daughter to visitors as the heart of this family. Jessamyn's fury was quieter and more dangerous. Her engagement to Sir Gideon, which should have been the defining triumph of the season, had been eclipsed entirely by the spectacle of the most powerful duke in England courting the sister everyone had dismissed. Within months, further humiliation arrived. A London solicitor uncovered evidence that Gideon's Ashbrook Hall estate was leveraged against debts exceeding its total value. His courtship of Jessamine had been, from the beginning, a financial rescue operation disguised as romance. The engagement collapsed publicly, and Jessamine returned to Thornhaven carrying the particular bitterness of a woman whose beauty had failed to protect her from being used. Rosalind's situation deteriorated in parallel. The Viscount's brother disappeared from correspondence entirely after learning that the Caverley family's disposable wealth was smaller than he had estimated. Rosalind accepted the abandonment with outward composure but inward fury directed, inexplicably, toward Elowen. The proposal came on a September evening beside the lake at Thornhaven, beneath skies streaked with the last amber light of summer. Theron spoke without rehearsal, without grand gestures, without an audience. I have spent years believing that what I lost could never be replaced. You have not replaced it. You have shown me that something entirely different can exist beside it. Elowen studied his face carefully. She recognized the risk in what he was offering because she understood what it cost a person to open a door they had sealed shut after terrible loss. She recognized it because she had done the same thing herself. She said yes quietly, and meant it completely. The wedding took place at Blackmere Chapel overlooking the sea. It was a small ceremony attended by fewer than 50 guests, a choice that scandalized London society but suited both of them perfectly. Seraphine wept openly throughout the service. Neve, who Elowen had insisted accompany her to Blackmere as her personal attendant, stood near the chapel entrance, clutching a handkerchief and smiling through tears. The early months of the marriage were the happiest period either of them had experienced in years. Blackmere softened visibly under Elowen's presence. She reorganized the household staff with the same quiet efficiency she had applied at Thornhaven, but added something Lord Osric's estate had never possessed: genuine warmth. Servants began smiling in corridors. Cooks started preparing meals with renewed energy after Elowen visited the kitchen personally to learn everyone's name and family situation. The great dining table accommodated 2 place settings now, positioned beside each other rather than at opposite ends, and most evenings ended with conversation that lasted well past the candles burning low. Theron began attending social engagements again, though selectively. With Elowen beside him, the performances that had previously exhausted him became tolerable because she understood the exhaustion and never pretended otherwise. After particularly draining evenings, they walked the cliff-top paths together in silence, and the silence felt like rest rather than isolation. Elowen also transformed Blackmere's relationship with its surrounding communities. She established the same charitable networks she had maintained at Thornhaven, visiting tenant families personally, organizing seasonal supply deliveries, and ensuring that aging workers received fair treatment. Within months, the Ashworth name, which had always commanded respect born from fear, began earning something rarer: gratitude born from genuine care. Villagers who had previously crossed the road to avoid Blackmere's steward now waved at the Duchess's carriage when it passed through market squares. Theron noticed the change, and it stirred something he had not expected. Watching Elowin rebuild connections he had allowed to decay during his years of isolation reminded him of what Karenna had once done inside these same walls. But where Karenna's warmth had been instinctive, Elowin's was deliberate. She chose kindness, knowing full well what cruelty looked like from the inside. That knowledge made her generosity feel sturdier, less like temperament and more like principle. For the first time since Karenna's death, Blackmere felt like a home rather than a monument to grief. Seraphine visited more frequently, and during one autumn stay, she pulled Elowin aside after dinner while Theron attended to correspondence. "You have given me back my son," the Dowager Duchess said quietly, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. "I had grieved for him while he still lived. You ended that grief." Elowin held the older woman's hands and said nothing, because some gratitude arrives in forms too large for words to carry. Then the pressure began. It started with questions so carefully phrased they almost disguised themselves as innocent conversation. Seraphine, during a spring visit, placed her hand over Elowin's at breakfast and asked gently whether there might be happy news to share soon. The question was asked with love, but it planted a seed of expectation that began growing immediately. Within months, the questions multiplied. Lord Osric's letters to Theron mentioned legacy and continuation with increasing frequency. Political associates raised the subject of heirs during business discussions with the casual cruelty of men who considered reproduction a strategic matter rather than a personal one. Society newspapers published speculative paragraphs wondering when the Ashworth line would be secured. Elowin conceived twice during the first year. Both pregnancies ended in loss. The first, early enough that only Neve knew. The second, late enough that the grief carved itself permanently into the walls of Blackmere. Elowin spent 3 days in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling while Neve sat beside her, holding her hand without speaking. Theron stood in the doorway each evening but could not seem to enter the room fully, as though crossing the threshold would force him to confront a kind of loss he had already survived once and did not know if he could survive again. After the second loss, the physicians delivered their assessment with the detached precision of men discussing structural deficiencies in a building rather than devastation inside a marriage. The likelihood of carrying a child to full term was, in their professional opinion, very small. Theron received the news in his study with the same motionless composure he had maintained the night Karenna died. Elowin watched something close behind his eyes and felt cold spread through her chest despite the fire burning beside them. He assured her the physician's opinion changed nothing. He held her hands and spoke firmly. She believed him because she needed to believe him, and because the alternative was too familiar to the pain she had spent years learning to survive. But the pressure did not stop. It intensified. And then Jessamine arrived at Blackmere. She came bearing gifts, sympathy, and the particular sweetness that had always preceded her cruelest maneuvering. She embraced Elowin at the entrance hall with tears that glistened convincingly beneath the chandelier light. "I came the moment I heard. You should not endure this without family beside you." Elowin, weakened by grief and desperate for connection she had never received from her sisters before, allowed the visit to extend, then extend further. Within weeks, Jessamine had established herself as a semi-permanent presence at Blackmere, occupying a guest suite with a view of the sea and inserting herself into household routines with the practiced ease of someone who had studied the estate's rhythms carefully before making a single visible move. She was charming with the staff. She was deferential toward Seraphine. She was tender with Elowin in exactly the ways Elowin had always wished her sister would be. And she was alone with Theron more frequently than anyone seemed to notice. The conversations between them started innocently. Jessamine asked about the shipping operations with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. She discussed parliamentary matters with surprising knowledge. She listened to Theron with the attentive stillness that powerful men consistently mistake for admiration when it is actually strategy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began introducing a subject no one else dared raise directly with the Duke. The Ashworth name carries 3 centuries of history. Elowin understands that better than anyone. She would not want legacy to end because of circumstances beyond her control. The word legacy carried a weight that settled over Blackmere like a change in season. Jessamine never said what she meant directly. She never needed to. She simply ensured the question remained present inside every conversation, every silence, every room Theron entered. She mentioned it beside the fireplace during afternoon tea. She referenced it casually during supper when discussing parliamentary families who had secured their futures through strategic arrangements. She planted the idea so consistently and so subtly that Theron began thinking about it as though the thought had originated inside his own mind, rather than being placed there by careful, patient hands. One evening, Elowyn passed the drawing room and heard Jessamine speaking to Theron in a tone so gentle it bordered on tenderness. "You carry too much responsibility alone, Your Grace. Elowyn worries about burdening you. She told me so herself. She would never ask you to sacrifice the Ashworth legacy for her sake. She loves you too deeply for that." The manipulation was exquisite. Every word positioned Jessamine as Elowyn's advocate, while slowly undermining the marriage from within. Every sentence expressed concern for Elowyn while making Theron feel that choosing legacy over his wife was somehow an act of love rather than betrayal. Elowyn stood outside the door long enough to hear her sister's voice soften further before she walked away. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even. But something inside her had begun preparing for an ending she could feel, approaching the way animals sense storms before the sky changes. Meanwhile, Elowyn felt the distance growing between herself and her husband, the way one senses a tide retreating. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily enough that the cold accumulated without any single moment being alarming enough to address. Theron spent longer evenings inside his study. Their conversations grew shorter. The clifftop walks became less frequent. When Elowyn reached for his hand at dinner, he held it, but his grip felt like obligation rather than desire. She told herself she was imagining the change. She told herself grief distorted perception. She told herself that the man who had proposed beside the lake was still the same man sitting across the darkening dining table. Then Neve told her what she had been refusing to see. "Miss Jessamine has been meeting privately with the Duke inside his study, twice this week, with the door closed." Elowyn felt the floor shift beneath her, not violently, slowly. The way the ground shifts before a structure that appeared permanent reveals it was built on something that could not hold. She said nothing to Theron. She said nothing to Jessamine. She waited. And the waiting was worse than knowing because it contained every possible version of the truth simultaneously, and none of them left her intact. The physicians returned to Blackmere on a Tuesday morning in late November. Rain fell steadily against the manor windows, while gray light pressed through the corridors like something too tired to push further. Elowyn watched from the upstairs landing as two men in dark coats were escorted toward Theron's study by Bramwell. She had not been informed they were coming. The door closed behind them. An hour later, a maid delivered a brief message. The Duke wished to speak with her in his study that evening after dinner. The formality of the request told Elowyn everything the words themselves did not. Husbands do not summon wives they intend to comfort. They summon wives they intend to address. She spent the afternoon in the small sitting room overlooking the eastern gardens, the room she had quietly made her own since arriving at Blackmere. Rain blurred the glass while she sat motionless in the chair beside the window, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing steady and measured. She did not cry. She did not pace. She sat with the stillness of someone preparing to walk into a room where something irreversible would happen, and knowing that the only thing she could control was how she walked. On the side table beside her chair rested a small leather notebook, the same one she had kept since Thornhaven, listing tenant families, their children's names, their particular needs. She had continued the practice at Blackmere. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, evidence of years spent caring about people most of society considered invisible. She ran her thumb across the notebook's worn cover without opening it. Whatever happened tonight, this would remain true about her. No conversation inside any study could erase what these pages represented. Neve entered late in the afternoon carrying tea Elowyn had not requested. "You do not have to go in there tonight." Elowyn looked at her maid with an expression that carried years of accumulated understanding. "Yes, I do." Neve stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding the teacup with both hands, studying the woman she had served since childhood. She had watched Elowyn endure things that would have broken most people long before this evening. She had watched her absorb cruelty from her own family without complaint, carry grief from Emery's death without sharing it, build a life inside Blackmere with generosity that never asked for recognition, and lose 2 children without once blaming anyone, including herself. Neve understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that whatever was about to happen inside that study, Elowen would survive it. Not because she was strong in the way the world typically measured strength, but because she had been surviving things her entire life that the people around her never even noticed were happening. Dinner passed in near silence. Jessamine was absent from the table, a detail that registered with the precision of a key turning inside a lock Elowen had been pretending was not there. Theron ate mechanically, his attention fixed somewhere far beyond the food before him. Twice, Elowen considered speaking. Twice, she decided against it. When the plates were cleared, Theron stood without a word and walked toward his study. Elowen followed several minutes later. The study felt colder than any room in Blackmere had felt since the night Corinna died. Frost covered the tall windows while wind pressed against the manor walls from the northern cliffs. Firelight threw long shadows across the bookshelves. The scent of untouched whiskey and fading firelight hung in the heavy air. Theron stood behind his mahogany desk with both hands pressed against the polished wood, his jaw tight, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the frozen glass. He did not turn when she entered. "You wish to speak with me?" He exhaled slowly. The sound carried weight far beyond breathing. The physicians confirmed their findings again this morning. Elowen felt cold air press against her chest. "We have discussed this, Theron." The silence that followed lasted long enough for the fire to pop twice beside them. Then he spoke the words that ended everything. "Your sister will give me an heir." They landed the same way they had landed in the opening of this story, like fractures splitting through frozen glass. But now, they carried the full weight of everything behind them. Every year of being dismissed inside Thornhaven. Every moment of invisible labor performed without recognition. Every cruelty absorbed without complaint. The loss of Emery. The grief of 2 children who never arrived. The careful, terrifying hope she had permitted herself when Theron placed a ring on her hand beside the lake and promised her something she had stopped believing existed. All of it compressed into 5 words spoken by a man who would not turn around to face her while saying them. "Jessamine has already agreed. The arrangement will remain private until a child is confirmed." Elowen stood motionless in the center of the study. The fire crackled softly beside her. Wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere deep inside Blackmere, a door closed distantly, echoing through the corridors like the final note of a piece of music that would never be played again. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not ask him to reconsider, to look at her, to remember who she was before this room reduced her to a problem requiring a solution. Instead, she did the one thing no one in her entire life had ever expected Elowen Caverly to do. She acted for herself, slowly, with hands that refused to tremble. She pulled the sapphire ring from her left hand. The ring he had placed there himself beside the lake at Thornhaven, while September light faded across the water. She set it gently on the edge of his desk. The quiet sound of stone meeting wood filled the study the way a single word can fill an empty room. Theron turned around for the first time, something fractured visibly across his expression when he saw the ring resting on the desk and her bare hand at her side. "Elowen." His voice broke on her name, but she was already walking toward the door. She paused once without turning back. "I survived my family treating me as worthless. I survived losing the first man who loved me. I survived this house and everything it demanded from me. But I will not survive becoming the woman who stayed after being told she was not enough. That is the one thing I will not carry." Then she walked out of the study, down the corridor, through the entrance hall, and into the cold November rain. Neve was waiting beside a carriage she had quietly arranged 2 hours earlier, because Neve had always understood what was coming before Elowen permitted herself to see it. The carriage pulled away from Blackmere while rain hammered against its roof. Elowen sat inside with her hands folded in her lap, watching the enormous estate shrink behind her through the water-streaked glass. She did not look back again. Inside the study, Theron stood alone, holding the sapphire ring. The fire had burned down to ash. The room felt emptier than it had felt since the night he lost Corinna, and for the first time in 7 years, Duke Theron Ashworth understood that he had just destroyed the most valuable thing he would ever possess, and he had done it himself. The years that followed Elowen's departure from Blackmere moved slowly across England, carrying consequences that settled into the lives of everyone this story has touched. Elowen did not return to Thornhaven. She traveled instead to the small coastal village of Heartstone, where an elderly aunt on her mother's side owned a modest stone cottage overlooking the sea. The cottage was simple, windswept, and entirely her own. For the first weeks, she did very little except walk the cliffside paths and sleep more deeply than she had in years. Nev, who had refused to remain at Blackmere without her, managed the cottage with the quiet devotion she had carried since Elowyn's childhood. Gradually, Elowyn began doing what she had always done. She organized food collections for the poorest families in the village. She established a small fund to provide winter clothing for children whose parents worked the fishing boats. She taught reading to young women inside the village church on Wednesday afternoons. She helped a fisherman's widow navigate a property dispute with a local landowner, spending weeks researching the relevant statutes until the widow's claim was upheld. Within 2 years, she had quietly become the most respected person in Heartstone. Not because of any title or family connection, but because every person she encountered was treated with the same steady kindness she had carried her entire life. A London publisher, after hearing about her charitable work through a mutual acquaintance, invited her to write about estate reform and tenant welfare. Her essays, published under her own name, attracted attention from reformers, philanthropists, and eventually members of Parliament who had previously dismissed such concerns as sentimental. Elowyn Caverly became a voice that people listened to because her words carried the authority of someone who had lived inside the systems she criticized and chose to build something better rather than simply endure them. Neve watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, the kind earned through decades of loyalty that never once wavered regardless of circumstance. "You are becoming the woman you always were, Miss Elowyn," Neve told her one evening while they sat beside the cottage fire. "You simply no longer have anyone preventing it." Meanwhile, every carefully constructed future surrounding her collapsed. Jessamyn's arrangement with Theron produced no heir. The physicians who had examined Elowyn delivered identical findings for her sister within the year. Jessamyn, who had entered Blackmere expecting triumph, found herself occupying a manor that felt like a mausoleum inhabited by a man who could barely look at her without seeing the choice that cost him everything. He spoke to her with the same polite distance he offered strangers at social gatherings. He never touched her hand across the dining table. He never walked the cliff-top paths with her. She existed inside Blackmere the way furniture exists inside a room, present and entirely without significance. She left 18 months later, carrying nothing except resentment and the belated understanding that she had destroyed her sister's marriage for a position that was never worth occupying. Rosalind's calculated maneuvering led her into a marriage with a minor landowner whose charm evaporated the moment the wedding contracts were signed. His debts consumed her dowry within 2 years. The strategic intelligence she had wielded so precisely inside Thornhaven proved worthless against a man who had studied her tactics and simply outmaneuvered them. She wrote letters to Elowyn that went unanswered for months, before a brief, kind reply arrived, inviting her to visit Heartstone if she needed rest. Lord Osric's political alliances fractured after the Ashworth connection dissolved. The railway investors Theron had once needed Lord Osric to access found alternative partnerships, and the Caverly family's influence diminished steadily until Thornhaven itself required significant financial restructuring to avoid insolvency. The estate that had once represented 4 generations of carefully maintained prestige began showing visible signs of decline. Paint peeled from the entrance columns. The south lawn went unmaintained. Servants left for better positions and were not replaced. Lady Venetia, confronted for the first time with consequences she could not manage through social performance, grew quieter with each passing season. She never spoke publicly about Elowyn's departure, but servants at Thornhaven reported finding her occasionally inside Elowyn's old bedroom, sitting beside the window, staring at the grounds where her eldest daughter once walked barefoot through morning gardens. The silk curtains she had replaced with plainer cotton years earlier remained unchanged. She could not bring herself to remove them now. Theron Ashworth did not remarry. He remained at Blackmere, maintaining his business operations with the same mechanical discipline he had always applied, but the estate never recovered the warmth Elowyn had brought into it. Servants returned to careful silence. The dining table accommodated one setting again. The cliff-top paths went unwalked. On his desk, beside the window overlooking the sea, the sapphire ring remained exactly where Elowyn had placed it. He never moved it. He never spoke about it. Bramwell dusted around it each morning without comment. Seraphine visited once after Elowin's departure. She sat in the study, looked at the ring on the desk, and said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the flatness of someone delivering a truth. They no longer had the energy to soften. Corinna was taken from you. Elowin, you sent away yourself. Those are not the same grief, Theron. One deserved your mourning. The other deserves your shame. She left that afternoon and did not return for over a year. When her letters arrived, they were shorter than before and carried none of the gentle prodding that had once characterized her attempts to reach her son. She had stopped trying. That absence hurt Theron more than any words she had spoken, because it meant the one person who had never given up on him had finally concluded there was nothing left to reach. 3 years after Elowin's departure, on a January afternoon when snow covered the Heartstone cliffs, 3 carriages arrived outside her cottage. Jessamine, Rosalind, and Lady Venetia stepped out, wearing older gowns and carrying expressions weighted with exhaustion rather than pride. None of them had visited before. None of them had been invited. Elowin received them inside the small sitting room beside the fire. Neve brought tea and warm bread without being asked. Snow pressed against the windows while the sea churned gray and white beyond the cliffs. None of her family could meet her eyes easily. The silence lasted long enough for the fire to settle twice before Lady Venetia spoke. I failed you, Elowin. Not once. Every single day you lived beneath my roof, I failed you. The words were imperfect and insufficient. They could not undo years of dismissal, cruelty, and complicit silence. But they were honest in a way Lady Venetia had never permitted herself before, and honesty, even late, carries weight that rehearsed apologies never reach. Jessamine spoke next, and her voice broke on the first word. I told myself I was helping the family. I told myself you would understand eventually, but I was not helping anyone. I wanted what you had because I could not accept that you deserved it, and I did not. It was the first truthful thing Jessamine had said to her eldest sister in years, perhaps in her entire life. Rosalind cried quietly. It was the first genuine emotion Elowin had ever witnessed from her youngest sister. The calculation that had governed every interaction Rosalind conducted since childhood had finally exhausted itself against a reality too painful to strategize around. Elowin studied the 3 women seated before her. She saw their exhaustion. She saw the damage life had delivered to each of them through the very alliances and strategies the family had once valued above her. She saw 3 people who had finally been forced to learn what she had understood since childhood, that worth built on appearances collapses the moment appearances can no longer be maintained. She poured them more tea. She offered them warm blankets against the cold. She spoke to them gently, without bitterness, without triumph, without the satisfaction that revenge would have provided and that grace made unnecessary. Because in the end, the ring Elowin placed on that desk was not a surrender. It was a declaration. It declared that her worth had never depended on being chosen by powerful men, or valued by her family, or validated by a society that measured women by what they produced rather than who they were. Her worth existed before any of them recognized it. It continued after every one of them failed to, and the world eventually learned what Thornhaven and Blackmere both discovered too late, that the woman they dismissed as not enough was the only person among them who had ever been complete.